So Seiko just released a mini version of the Samurai. Kind of. This is actually a much different watch than the original Samurai, but it certainly does carry over a lot of the same stylings. But the whole design has been refined, everything is sleeker and slimmer, and the case size has obviously been reduced down to 41.5 millimeters, which is going to make it much more manageable for people who like smaller watches or have smaller wrists. And this is one that I've been really excited to check out because it's been a while since Seiko has released a new kind of affordable dive watch in this segment. It's going to be probably priced around $575 initially at retail, which is very similar to what the original Samurai was released at. Take a quick look and then we'll dive into it. Hey guys, welcome back to Just the Watch. My name's Dave. I live in Japan and I love to collect affordable watches. And today we're taking a look at a watch that comes from Seiko, which is obviously based here in Japan. So always interested to see what they've got going on. Even more interested because the Samurai has been my favorite dive watch from Seiko for a while, especially in the kind of, again, more affordable range of Seiko's Prospex divers. I think this is a little bit similar to what Seiko did with the Mini Turtle, where they had the Turtle, which was very popular, and then they came out with a smaller version that wasn't an exact copy of it. They did some changes and tweaks to the design, and they've done the same thing here with the Samurai. This time, I think really giving it a focus on upgrading and refreshing the design to give it more of a premium look. It does sort of look more kind of like a luxury style watch, still maintaining a lot of the Seiko Samurai classic looks. But this is still an affordable Prospex diver from Seiko, which means that the specifications are going to reflect that. It's based on the 4R35 automatic movement. It features Hardlex and not Sapphire, which in 2024, that's getting more and more difficult to put up with, but it still has a lot of advantages and a lot of things that I really like about it. I want to focus on three things in this review. And the first is a comparison between this watch and the original Samurai. This watch is an evolution of the Samurai design, but it's not just a smaller Samurai. It could be considered something like a version 3 Samurai. It's like a totally new model. But I don't think that this is a replacement to the original Samurai because of the size difference here. I think Seiko will continue to manufacture both. The second thing is simply looking at this from a reviewer's perspective of, is this a good watch? Is it a solid design? Is it good build? What are its pros and cons? And finally, I want to wrap this up by talking about the price and the value of this watch, because there's been a lot of controversy regarding Seiko and their pricing structure of late. And this being what is effectively a new affordable Prospex diver for Seiko, I think it sheds a lot of insight into where Seiko is going in terms of price. But I want to start by talking about the heritage of this watch in the Samurai lineage. The Samurai is a very interesting watch in Seiko's catalog, particularly when you're talking about the more affordable Seiko dive watches, the kind of entry-level ones. The Samurai is one of Seiko's core watches in that category, but it's interesting in the fact that it doesn't have this long vintage history. You can trace the Turtle all the way back to the 70s with the Captain Willard and that kind of case design, and see that it definitely shares some of the same design philosophy there. The SKX, which now lives on in Seiko's catalog in the Seiko 5 Sports divers, can trace its design heritage to some of Seiko's models that they pioneered back in the late 80s and 90s. But the Samurai comes from a much more recent design, with the first version coming out in 2004, and it really wasn't until 2017 when they came out with the version 2, which released after a multi-year gap where it wasn't in production, and it finally bursted out into this mainstay of Seiko's affordable catalog. The Samurai has always been characterized by a very angular case with sharp, aggressive hands and a unique original design that is pure Seiko. And Seiko's ability to come up with new watch designs like this that are not rehashing the design work that other bigger brands have done in the past is, in my opinion, one of the most attractive things about Seiko as a watch brand. Now, obviously, in recent years, the bulk of their watches and releases have been evolutions or reissues of watches from their own past, with the watch we're looking at today being another example of that. But these designs belong to Seiko. They're a part of Seiko's history and heritage, and they have a respect for these designs and an understanding of these designs that's far deeper than any of the other brands out there that are copying them. And I think that's something that you really see on this new Samurai. Because like I said, this is not simply taking the Samurai and changing something like the dimensions of it. This is a totally different watch. And yet it's a watch that has a clear design heritage in the Samurai line, in my opinion. Now, the most important difference is probably still the dimensions. The original Samurai is 43.5 millimeters in diameter. This new one loses 2 millimeters, dropping it all the way down to 41.5. So it is a much smaller, much more wearable watch. It doesn't dominate your wrist in the same way that the previous Samurai did. So if you have smaller wrists or simply like a smaller case size, this is definitely something to check out if you're interested in that Samurai style. However, one thing to note is the lug-to-lug on this is actually a little bit longer than the previous Samurai. The previous Samurai had a very short lug-to-lug of 48 millimeters. This is something that Seiko often does on their watches. The lug-to-lug is oftentimes much shorter than you would expect given the diameter of their cases. Here you're actually getting a 49 millimeter lug-to-lug, which is still very manageable, but that really does change up the overall shape of the case. The old Samurai was kind of this square, blocky look. This is a much longer, stretched out, sleeker look. And in fact, I think sleekness is something that really defines this new one in comparison to the previous Samurai. The case thickness has dropped from 13 millimeters down to 12 millimeters. And rather than the case being a flat case, the case has a curve to it, which is going to help it conform to your wrist better, which is going to help negate that slightly longer lug-to-lug when it comes to how it looks and feels on your wrist. Likewise, everything about this watch, from the case to the dial design to the bracelet, just feels more refined than the older Samurai. You're losing a little bit of character. I think the older Samurai was a bolder, if somewhat awkward looking watch. This one looks a little bit more normal while still also retaining a lot of the unique features that made the Samurai interesting. One obvious example is with the lug design, which is particularly noticeable on the non-crown side of the case. The old Samurai had these kind of interesting blocky lugs that were meant to look like they were sort of a separate or attached to the case. They weren't. It was a solid piece of metal that was just the way that the case was casted. But on this new Samurai, it's just a flat continuous surface that's much sleeker than the previous one. Looking at the watch from the top, you can also see that the case is a lot more conformed to the bezel. On the larger Samurai, there's more of the case that's visible around the bezel that kind of gives it a square frame. But here you're getting a much more traditional silhouette. But on the lugs and crown, they did retain those flat angular surfaces that kind of call to mind the Samurai look. Another departure or improvement, in my opinion, is the bezel. This is still just an aluminum bezel insert, so it's going to be prone to scratching and wear or patina, but it is a much higher quality and better looking bezel insert. Rather than the indexes simply being printed onto the insert, they're first engraved and then filled with white paint, which actually makes a very huge difference in the impression that this watch gives off. It comes across, I think, as a much more expensive watch than the Samurai. Visually, I think it more calls to mind luxury dive watches, whereas the original Samurai was just this big, brutish tool watch. So very different personalities here between the two. And I gotta say, I think that new bezel is one of my favorite parts of this watch. I think it really does look good. In that vein, I think the action on the bezel has also been upgraded significantly. It still feels like a Seiko bezel. It has that kind of springy, clicky feel to it, but it just has a more refined, almost higher definition feel to the clicks. The resistance is a little bit higher on this new bezel, but it still feels great when you're actuating it. The only problem is that the bezel is slimmer here, so it is harder to get a good grip on, which is a bit annoying. But let's move down to the dial, which is where I think you can see the biggest changes that have been made. I went with the red version of this watch because I thought it was the most interesting, and I definitely also wanted to get a version with the bracelet because I wanted to evaluate that as well. This is a very uncommon color for Seiko, so it's cool to see them branching out a bit. And while I love the vibrant red color of the bezel insert, I'm less pleased with the sort of muted color of the dial itself. It's almost kind of a dark rust color. It's not my cup of tea, but I think it works well and it offers a lot of contrast for the hands and markers. So it's cool to see this unique color from Seiko where they're also maintaining that high visibility and legibility. It's just not a color that I'm particularly drawn to myself. Now, there's been a lot of changes to the dial here from the previous Samurai. The one that I noticed right off the bat is that they moved the date from the 3 o'clock position down to a 4:30 position, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to have opinions about. I tend to be okay with 4:30 dates if they're done for a good design purpose. And the nice thing here is that by moving the date away from one of the markers, you can have all 12 of your markers on the dial. So it allows those hour indexes to have perfect symmetry without one of them being replaced by a date. but then you've got this sort of awkwardly unsymmetrical placement of that date at 4:30. But the date is fairly small. It's done with a circular, unframed cutout. And while it's not color match, it's still a dark black background to the date wheel, so it's not that noticeable. It kind of looks like Seiko was trying to go with a clean, no date look while still giving you the date complication. And I kind of appreciate that because I'm one of those people that has to have a date on a watch. So I'll take a 4:30 date over no date any day. That said, I would have still preferred either a 3 o'clock or 6 o'clock date position. Another big change that you might not notice off the bat is that they've moved to a stainless steel rehaut instead of a printed chapter ring. Most of Seiko's affordable dive watches feature the minute printing on a chapter ring. Here, those small ticks have been moved down to the dial itself, which allows for a brushed silver chapter ring to be included. And again, this is a small thing, but I think it makes a really big visual impression in making this look more like a luxury style watch, more of a premium looking watch. It's another change that I really like here. And because Seiko is infamous for having misaligned chapter rings, they completely eliminate that possibility with this chapter ring here. So great 200 IQ move there. Hour markers have been switched over from simple bars to shark's teeth, and the handset has been completely redone. Particularly on dive watches, I love to see custom hour hands, so it's cool to see that Seiko has done something unique here. The hour hand on the previous Samurai was a very short, sharp arrowhead, whereas this one I feel like looks more like the tip of a spear. As is the trend with this watch, it's a little bit more refined, a little bit more interesting and elegant. I think the same can be said for the minute hand, which I think is a little bit more sword-like, almost katana-like in its shape. They come with a brushed finish that looks really good. Taking a little bit of a step back, this watch also retains the same knurling on the side of the bezel and on the crown that the previous Samurai had. It's a cool, unique look that I really like, and it continues to work well in this design. The bracelet is, however, new, and I think they've done a great job here. The bracelet on the previous Samurai, I don't think ever quite fit with the design very well. It looked like it was something that they just sort of threw on it to give it a bracelet option. Here, the bracelet is much more angular, and I think it fits the theme of the watch much better. It seems like it was made for this watch, and that's particularly evident in the excellent end links. These really fit the watch well, both from a design standpoint with the angles that are employed and the way that they flow from the case down to the bracelet. These are solid end links. The bracelet is a solid link bracelet. It feels very sturdy and very premium, much better than the bracelets than you get on the Seiko 5 Sports models. However, the clasp is basically the same clasp that came on the previous Samurai. It's made out of stamped metal. It's not particularly premium. However, it is extremely functional, very comfortable, very well built, and it does include a dive extension. Would have been nice to see an improved clasp on here, just like it would have been nice to see sapphire, but this is still a watch from Seiko, so Hardlex it is. Now, one concern with the Hardlex crystal on this watch is that unlike the previous Samurai, rather than it being recessed under the bezel, the crystal actually rises up slightly above the bezel, which is going to make it a little bit more vulnerable to picking up nicks and scratches, especially if you happen to set the watch face down. And that right there might just be the biggest deal breaker for a lot of people, particularly when we start to talk about the cost of this watch, which looks like in the US is probably going to retail for around $525. But as with most Seiko watches, we'll probably see that price settle a bit on the gray market. But this is a brand new release, so it's still hard to predict exactly where it's going to wind up. All right, so I think that covers the main comparisons of this watch to the previous Samurai. Let's take a little bit of a step back and talk about how it functions just as a watch in general. From a design standpoint, not related to the original Samurai or anything, I think this is a great looking watch from Seiko. Again, I think this is an original design. It's something that is fresh, that doesn't call to mind other watches from other brands. And while this watch continues to fit right in Seiko's entry-level Pro Specs line in terms of specifications, still featuring the NH35 movement and again that Hardlex crystal, the refinements to the watch, especially taking into account that bezel with the engraved markings and that brushed metal chapter ring, really give this a more premium look. So if you're looking for a watch from Seiko that is both cool and competent, I think this is a really attractive offer. I'm really happy with the design of this watch. On the technical side of things, one of the most important things to keep in mind is that this is a certified dive watch, which means that it has been tested to work up to that 200 meters. This does incur a significant cost to Seiko, which is why most brands don't go through with it. But in my opinion, having that peace peace of mind of knowing that the watch has been tested and verified to work to its stated water resistance is better than things like helium release valves or crazy 1,000 meter water resistance ratings on watches that haven't actually been tested to those depths. Let's move on to a couple of cons, at least when it comes to the technical aspects of this watch. The first being the Lume performance here is a little bit lower than I would have hoped for. I ran it through my Lume scoring system, and this one came out with a score of a 7, which is below the average of 10 that I usually find on Seiko divers. You can see it here against my original Seiko Samurai, which I've had for a few years now, and when I initially scored this one, it did hit that 10 mark, but Lume does degrade over time, and so after a few years, this one's dropped down to about an 8, but it's still outperforming the Lume on the brand new Mini Samurai. Now, a score of 7 is not a terrible score. It's a little bit below average, but as far as performance go, this should still give you all the glow that you would actually need on a dive, and it gives you completely adequate after dark performance, but is not particularly impressive. But for Seiko, it is disappointing to see Lume at this level. I would have expected and hoped for it to be stronger. The more worrisome aspect about this watch is that there is a significant amount of dust under the crystal, which is just unacceptable here. And this is particularly true because this is the JDM made in Japan version, so you would have hoped that if Seiko was doing things in country, they would have done a better job at quality control. And I've had a lot of Seiko watches. Most of them have not had quality control issues. Still, Seiko has become known for having issues like this. And so when you see things like this, it really does stick out and confirm that reputation that Seiko has unfortunately been getting in recent years. Okay, let's move on to the third and final thing I wanted to talk about, which is the cost of this watch. Based on the components of this watch, the Hardlex crystal and that 4R35 movement inside of it, this does put it in Seiko's entry-level range as far as dive watches go. Their more premium and mid-level dive watches will have sapphire crystals. You'll get things like 6R movements. So the components definitely put this in the same category as the original Seiko and as the Seiko Turtle. But you are seeing an increase in price over those previous models, which are still available. Here in Japan, the retail price is listed at 83,600 yen. I pre-ordered mine on Amazon at a discount. And as far as prices in yen go, that's pretty high compared to Seiko's other watches, but I think that's also due in part because the value of the yen is very low right now. Now, Seiko USA hasn't released a retail price, at least I'm not seeing it posted on their website yet, but I am seeing it listed at exquisite timepieces for $575, and this is compared to the retail price on the original Samurai being $525, so they're pricing it at $50 higher retail price. But if you look at the price of the full-size Samurai on Amazon, that one's running at right around $400, so that's around $125 below the retail price. And this is something that always happens with Seiko's watches after a few years. They release them at their retail prices, and then they tend to drop when they get onto other resellers. So as always, you're going to pay a bit of an early adopter tax. If you want to buy this watch now, it is going to come in at that $575 in the US. But wait a year or so and we might see this dropping down closer to $400 or $450. But no matter which way you slice it, this is being priced at above the previous Samurai. As noted, there are a few minor upgrades. The bezel's a little bit nicer with the engraving there. It's got that metal rehaut, but I don't think that these upgrades are enough to justify that price increase. As far as components and materials go, this is very similar to the original Samurai, and it's still being priced above that. But it's not being priced that much more above it, and I think because of the differences in this watch, particularly the size and the refinements, it's still going to be an attractive option for a lot of people. If you're a fan of Seiko, people are going to criticize this price because it does not have a sapphire crystal. They're going to complain about the lack of milled clasp, and they'll point to micro brands and AliExpress brands that offer these features at a much lower price, which are all valid complaints. However, I do think that Seiko offers things that these other brands don't. The most important being the design here. It doesn't matter how well spec'd a watch is. If it's an ugly watch, you're not going to wear it. And a lot of people are not interested in watches that are direct copies of luxury watches that are knockoffs, or what a lot of people euphemistically refer to as homages. And for me, I'm willing to pay a little bit higher price to get a good original design. On the technical side of things, you also have to keep in mind that this is a professionally rated dive watch, which is something that most of those other lower cost watches don't offer. And I think that diver's rating does make this a much more reliable dive watch. It does give you a lot more peace of mind when it comes to the water resistance here. You can make the argument that a watch that hasn't been through water resistance testing that the ISO certification process gives you isn't a true dive watch, it's just a dive style watch. And so to me, this dive rating is an important part of the watch, and it does factor into my evaluation of its cost. So where I'm personally landing with this release from Seiko, I think at the full retail price, it's an acceptable price to pay, except for those quality control issues. There should definitely not be dust under the glass at this price, but as long as you get a clean watch, I think it's worth that initial price. If the price does drop down to around $450 in the next year or two, I think it will be a very good price for this watch. But possibly what I'm most looking forward to is them doing a kind of King Mini Samurai version where they throw in a sapphire crystal and maybe even an engraved ceramic bezel. Those King versions, which are upgraded versions of Seiko's entry-level dive watches, I think are one of the coolest offerings in the affordable market. You're getting iconic dive watches from Seiko with upgraded specifications, usually at a price that's well under $1,000. So here's hoping that this watch will be a success that will be followed up by other color variants and some of those upgraded editions as well in the future. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for today. Drop me a comment down below in the comments. Let me know what you think of this watch from Seiko. Is the new size and the more refined design enough to tempt you to pay that slightly higher price that Seiko is asking for the specifications compared to micro brands and a lot of the AliExpress brands? I think that it is, but I also think there's probably going to be a lot of controversy around that point down below. If you're interested in getting a watch-themed t-shirt like this one, you can check out on my website at justthewatch.com. That's going to wrap up for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.